The puzzle of why the Industrial Revolution happened when and where it did is about to take another leap back in time. So far, our think tank has traced back a number of different threads to medieval times. Now they are going back 1,000 years to look at two activities which have always played a significant role in the evolution of society. The first is agriculture. The second is warfare. Warfare and agriculture both demand tremendous exertion of human energy. In the first half of this 1,000-year time period, warfare was rife in the East and West, but gradually that would change. The East became relatively peaceful, while the West remained locked in combat. So the question is whether the delicate balance between war and peace could affect a country's chances of becoming an industrial nation. During times of peace, agriculture tied up most of the working population. Yet this pattern would change in the West. Increasingly, wheels and animals were used to carry loads, whereas the East continued to rely on human labor.
One of the things that puzzles me, particularly if you look at a place like Japan, where the wheel almost disappears, water wheels, likewise windmills. Now I wondered, why is it that the West gets more and more interested in animals, water power, wind power?
The use of water and subsequently wind is just one of the ways in which people try to exploit non-human energy, try to get nature to do the work for you so that you don't have to work so hard. And in some sense, the ultimate purpose of technology is to reduce human effort.
To help understand why labor-saving technology only evolves in some societies, Alan Macfarlane comes to a remote part of the Himalayas. Here, his anthropological research allows him to study the daily toil of pre-industrial life.
I've been coming to this valley in central Nepal for some 30 years now, almost every year for the last 12 years. One of the reasons I do that is that this is as far as the car can reach. Civilization, in the modern sense, ends here. Beyond this, no motor transport, and in fact no electricity or more modern sewage or anything else. So every step you take from here onwards is a step backwards in time. So basically when you come here and you're seeing what it must have been like over most of the world before all these things happened. So you see people using basically their bodies, their backs, their legs, their arms, to try and wrest a living out of it. And watching how they do it helps you to understand history over a long period. We've almost forgotten in the West what it must have been like to live like this.
Alan Macfarlane believes that by comparing patterns of agriculture in the East and West, it might yield clues as to why the Industrial Revolution happened in Europe rather than Asia. Because of the altitude and climate up here, people are able to grow both the European and Asian types of grain. So it's possible to contrast how much work is involved with each crop.
The two main grain systems of the world are hard grains like millet, wheat, maize and so on, which is European grains, and soft grain, particularly rice. Now, you'd think these are just grains and grains are grains, but in fact, they're very, very different and their implications are enormous. Rice is a miracle plant. It's really a vegetable that grows in swamps, domesticated, and each piece of rice produces a huge number of seeds, up to 100. You only have to keep one to replant, whereas European grains on the whole produce much less per plant, and you will have to keep at least a 15th of the harvest to replant. So that's one great difference. Rice will feed a much denser population. You get much more per acre from rice. The second difference is that rice responds very well indeed to added labor. Each one is really a little vegetable which you tend very carefully. You hand plant each one in turn, and depending on how careful you are with the weeding and the water, you get more or less rice. So you can build up the population, and each new person is welcome because more rice. This is one of the great differences, that the population that rice can support, not only because it's much more productive, but also because the more you work it, the better the rice, means that you get dense populations and very hard-working peoples. With rice, it's very difficult to get the husk off, very hard indeed. That's what protects them, the husk. So what you have to do with that is you have to apply a very sharp weight, very heavy weight onto the rice to get the husk off. So in this area, for example, you use a beater, which is operated by your feet. And that is very intensive, hard work using your legs. So rice is more labor-intensive at that stage. But at the next stage, once you've got the husk off with rice, it's ready for human consumption. Our digestive systems can eat this one grain by just putting it in water, boiling it, and you have a perfect meal. Now, the hard grains of the West are different. You just throw the seed, keep the weeds down, and that's it. They don't take quite so much work, although the soil is very heavy and you have to plough it. But certainly at the later stages, there's something very peculiar about them, which is once you get them off the husk, you can't eat them. You have to grind them. You can make them into a kind of porridge with milk and so on, but it takes a long time and it's not very pleasant. So in order to make bread, which was favoured in the West, you have to mill it.
The grindstone, or rotary quern, was as popular in England 1,000 years ago as it is in Nepalese villages today. But something happened in England to change that way of life. Water power began to take over from human power.
Enormous amount of power. I mean, if you transfer that into horsepower, is there any way of guessing how many horsepower?
About 5 horsepower.
About 5 horsepower. The puzzle is why villagers would bother to come from their homes in which they could have had their own personal querns and come and milled here. Why do they do that?
Well, in medieval times, the lord of the manor probably owned the mill. He sublet the mill to a miller and his family ran it, but he would be getting the profit from milling, so he discouraged the hand querns. Some of them were even taken away and broken, so the people were forced then to bring the grain to the mill to be milled.
So it was a monopoly of the
A monopoly, yes.
So it was the beginning, in a sense, of capitalism as well as industrial civilization, because to construct something like this would be very expensive, wouldn't it? I mean, if you go to an Indian village or a Chinese village in the past, you'd never find a huge building like this full of machinery, full of complicated craft work, producing a product, which is really what industrialization is. As you did this, the idea began to spread, well, if the machine can take the strain, or the animal can take the strain, why should we do it? So you began to get a civilization in England particularly, and Holland and Northern Europe, which was renowned for being very lazy. They worked, but compared to the arduous, endless work of most peasant civilizations, the Northwest Europeans would, whenever possible, think of an alternative to using their back and their muscles. So putting all of this into two words which make the contrast. In China, Japan, India, and here in Nepal, they had an industrious revolution. That is, people were more and more hard-working, and this led them towards a kind of civilization which is immensely hard, labor-intensive. In Europe, we had famously an industrial revolution where you replaced human labor with machines and non-human power.
According to Alan Macfarlane, the gradual evolution of the machine age in Europe can be traced back to the fields of wheat and barley. He believes there is a direct link between the type of grain and the type of technology that emerges. But not everyone is convinced by this theory. Some rice-growing civilizations, such as China, did use machines, as Christopher Cullen points out.
I can't say why the West do things that China doesn't do. One thing I would draw attention to is the fact that, of course, the Chinese are very successful in using water power for a large number of purposes. So if you want to say, you know, can they make use of this power when they want to, they certainly can.
What happened in China up to 1000 AD was that agriculture changed from farming dry wheat in fashions familiar to Europeans in the north to wet rice cultivation in the south. Wet rice cultivation, because the rice plant is essentially a specialized swamp grass, means that you've got to create an artificial and carefully controlled swamp. And if you can do that just right, and it's a tricky business to get it just right, then you've got one of the most highly productive and secure crops that human beings have ever produced. No nation that's ever taken up eating rice has ever given it up voluntarily in exchange for something else. If you are into wet rice agriculture, you need machines to raise water out of your field if you find you've got too much, or to raise water into your fields if you've got too little. And as well as that, of course, there are all kinds of other applications to which machinery of various kinds can be applied, such as, for instance, say, machines for hulling rice. You do need to hull the rice. So I wouldn't say that medieval China, with its rich wet rice agriculture, was devoid of opportunities for making machines.
So if there were plenty of machines, the puzzle is why they didn't evolve into larger scale mills.
I don't know why the Industrial Revolution didn't happen in China. That's the problem. I'm unable to produce a nice factor that says, you know, sort of why, because I'm not sure the point is proved that medieval China is a sort of a less mechanical place than the medieval Europe.
Perhaps the key lies not in technological differences, but in the way society is organized. China continued to be dominated by the philosophy of Confucius, who has been described as the patron saint of Chinese bureaucracy.
There are two big differences between the structure of society in pre-modern China and in Europe. For a start, in China, there was no aristocracy of political importance. The real governing power, apart from the emperor, is exercised by the scholar official class, who are recruited by and large through examinations in Confucian classics and in Confucian ideology, the mode through which people express their feeling about a certain kind of social order, a hierarchic social order in which we all know our duty to those above us, in which children know their duty to their parents, ministers know their duty to their ruler, students know their duty to their teacher. If you look at a man called Sung Ying-sing, who's active in the early 17th century, he writes a book on science and technology and laments that no one's going to read this book because it's got nothing to do with passing the official examinations.
In the preface, he laments, look, I'd really like to have made this a better book. I'd have liked to have got some people together to talk about the things in this, but I've got no funds, and so I've had to do all this myself. And as for you, sir, who might be picking up this book in a bookshop, you'll probably want to cast this aside without reading it, because it certainly won't help you advance in the Imperial Civil Service at all, so forget about it.
If you compare that with his contemporary, Georg Bauer, in what later became Germany, the man who wrote a book on mining called De Re Metallica, he was able to move from country to country, and also from one kind of job to another. He practiced as a doctor, he taught Greek at a university, and he also became involved with mining. There were all kinds of roles open to him, all kinds of places. The point is, there were many more possible points for diversity in Europe, many more margins at which one could carve out something new.
Harnessing natural power became a European obsession, the most important medieval machine in England was the watermill.
By the 16th century, most villages would have had one or two large mills like this, and that would mean that in order to maintain these mills, to build them in the first place and then to keep them working, because they were grinding and grinding and grinding, you would need a whole lot of proto-engineers, people who understood how machinery works, who can think of better ways of improving it. So you've basically got a whole profession of industrial engineers all over England who are dealing with cogs and machinery, and this fed into things like clockmaking and other machinery. So that what we think of as the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century is really just the final effect of something which started hundreds of years earlier. It's no accident, in fact, that the first great industrial steam-powered buildings were called mills. All they were this plus steam.
But before mills were driven by steam, there was a further critical stage in the evolution of water mills. A new breed of artisans, called engineers, began to look at the world in a very different way. They were committed to maximizing the amount of energy that could be tapped from nature. Already in the 1770s, the French and the Brits decide there are limits to what you can get out of the world, and we, these highly trained experts, can advise you on what those limits are, and therefore what a reasonable investment opportunity is. And where this matters most, no question, in the 18th century, is water wheels. Certainly in the area with which our riddle begins, that is to say, Lancashire. Because in Lancashire, you have plausibly useful drops of height down which streams flow, especially in the area around Manchester. And they can drive mills. And French and British engineers do extremely precise experiments on the most efficient possible design for a water wheel. Should it be powered by having the stream run over the top of it, and then it will work by impact. The water will push against the wheel, and so it'll turn like this. Or should it be undershot and thus work by gravity, right? Well, highly precise experiments are done at the Royal Society by the civil engineers in Paris on the comparative advantages of overshot and undershot wheels. It turns out that overshot wheels are much more efficient. Overshot wheels spread like wildfire through Lancashire, and all of a sudden you have a vast increase in the efficiency, therefore the productivity, therefore the profit of the systems driving the new mills. Now, I think you can see that over the millennium now that we're interested in, what we have to explain at least is how did an attitude and a set of technologies like that emerge around water wheels, which I suppose we do not find in any other culture. Once you think of nature as just another engineering system, and you identify natural powers as sources of profit, it becomes self-evident that you should try to model natural systems so that you're using them to the greatest possible efficiency. Because without the machine philosophy, you don't see natural forces as forces of production. You don't see the fall of a waterfall or the boiling of steam as intensely something from which a profit can be made. So that when Matthew Boulton says, "I sell what every man wants, power," and he says it to Dr. Johnson in the 1780s, he's pulling together the machine philosophy, power means what you can generate from designing better machines, and the entrepreneurial philosophy, I sell power, I'm an entrepreneur. And I think it's the extraordinarily rich alliance of those two ideas. The world's a machine, you can make a profit out of using its forces. That distinguishes Western and Eastern approaches to these problems.
Power and profit were the keys to Western agriculture's impact on the age of steam. But there was a different kind of power, military power, which would also have far-reaching effects beyond the battlefields of East and West. When the balance shifts from peace to war, it has a dramatic impact on the acceleration of weapons technology. The question is how this affected the ability of the East and West to industrialize. The puzzle is that at the start of this 1,000 years, the armies of the East were far better equipped. They even had semi-automatic weapons.
What I have here is the working bit of a Chinese crossbow, and this particular device was mass-produced by the Imperial Workshops. It's even got a number 14 on it. Just like if you look on your rifle, you see it's got a War Department thing stamped on it, a number. So the possession of sophisticated weapons employing the highest technology you can get. So this thing's a really beautifully made device. I pull the trigger and zonk, off it goes, and I cock it again, ready for the next one here. This shows the Chinese were very ready to produce the very best in military technology. There's no sense that they have a gentle and unwarlike philosophy here. So it's not very surprising when they turn out to be the first people to use gunpowder weapons. It's going to go topple us. Aya! Aya!
Following ancient Chinese recipes, Mr. Lear makes up mixtures for demonstrating early gunpowder weapons.
The earliest recipe for gunpowder in China is found in a book published in 1044 called Wu Jing Zong Yao, the Essentials of the Military Classics. The recipe given there is essentially for an incendiary mixture designed to be thrown in packets to scare the enemy, set fire to things, or perhaps spread poisonous smokes. Later on, the amount of saltpeter in the mixtures increased, and as a result, the mixtures burned more rapidly with something of a whoosh.
You can imagine you have this packed with gunpowder, you have it also packed with bits of junk as well, and you're trying to climb up my city wall and I squirt this towards you. It discourages you somewhat and so on. And then of course there is the fact that if it's really got a good charge in it and I happen to hold it rather weakly, it may shoot off backwards, and then I've got a rocket, which is of course another Chinese invention.
The multiple rocket launcher was a medieval weapon used to fire arrows at advancing cavalry. The Chinese Empire was under constant threat from the nomads in the north. There's a strong contrast between the development of gunpowder weapons in China and in Europe. In 1067, a year after the Battle of Hastings in England had been won using bows and arrows, the Chinese emperor
was so concerned about the proliferation of the new weapons technology of gunpowder that he banned the export of the chief ingredients of gunpowder, sulfur and saltpeter, to the barbarians of the north. And he was right to be concerned, because over the century following his action, we see a true industrialization of warfare in China. So that 100 years after his action, we have got 11 large workshops in China with 40,000 people engaged in the manufacture of gunpowder weapons alone, and the state arsenals were turning out weapons at the rate of something like 3 million items a year. As a result of that, the armies of the Sung dynasty were certainly better equipped than any others in the world. On the other hand, when from the 13th century onwards these weapons find their way to Europe, they find their way into a rather undeveloped little world with all sorts of small states engaged in fierce military competition. There's therefore, in Darwinian terms, huge evolutionary pressure on gunpowder weapons, and they improve very rapidly because European states are prepared to put as much resources as are necessary into getting the drop on their neighbours, and guns help them to do that.
Bombard! 14th century! Firing! This is an early example of a hoop and stave cannon. The earliest guns were cast out of bronze, but bronze very expensive to cast, and so they developed this idea of hammer welding staves of iron together and then shrinking hot hoops, rather like a wooden barrel made in metal. And you would load this up, aim it at your fortress. Well, they are castle smashers. This is only a baby one, of course. The largest one had a bore of 33 inches and cast a stone of 900 pounds or more.
What then brings about the next major changes in gun design after this?
The growing use of bronze in casting guns, making them much lighter, manoeuvrable.
So you can start to carry them?
You could start to carry them about. First field gun, mid-15th century. Firing! Then, around about the middle of the 16th century, they moved on to cast iron guns in this country. We were behind everybody else on the continent, in Holland and Germany, 100 years advance of us. But gradually we got hold of the script and we were making cast iron guns. 6-pounder, the mid-16th century.
But there were big problems about having guns in cast iron,
Oh,
weren't
absolutely.
there? Because they could easily blow up in just the wrong kind of way.
They gave you no warning. Gunners hated them because a bronze gun, Simon, if it's going to blow, it bulges first. A bit like me, really. A cast iron gun gives no warning whatsoever. It will just burst like a bomb. 3-pounder Falcon, mid-17th century.
So it's a very good idea to have guns that are easy to move around, but you have to thicken up the barrel in order to actually make it an effective weapon.
The walls of the barrel became much, much thicker. So in the 19th century, you've got massive, thick, heavy guns which could withstand the impact of vast amounts of powder throwing out arm bores. 24-pounder, early 19th century. 64-pounder, late 19th century. Fire it!
It's this combination of extreme accuracy and range and power, I think, that is the culmination, isn't it, of 19th century, in fact, Western technology over the last 1,000 years. It's really important to remember that machines like this were made to kill people and destroy things. But they're also very much an element, I think a key element, in the way in which the whole of Western society turned itself into a system geared for mass production and the reliable engineering of extraordinary devices like this.
Across the world in China, the Ming dynasty eventually restored peace to the Middle Kingdom. If the wars of the previous centuries had turned out differently, perhaps China might have been fragmented into competing states, like Europe. Instead, it sealed off its borders to the rest of the world and was unified into a huge empire. To maintain peace, it outlawed gunpowder weapons. To prevent piracy and foreign trade, it banned ocean-going ships, and for a time, to complete the isolation, it even became illegal to teach Chinese to foreigners.
It's possible to explain how China's cut-off from interest in the world beyond the seas happened, but it's difficult to explain still really why it was made to happen. In the 15th century, China had achieved immense triumphs in penetrating the outside world, with great seaborne expeditions going away as far as Africa. But why exactly the political decision was taken in the Ming court to cut that activity off so quickly after the 1430s is still something of a mystery. It seems to have been that some of the conservative circles at court decided that this was a distraction from the primary activity of the state, which should be to support agriculture and to concentrate on the development of that as the basic activity of the Chinese population, and that all this sailing abroad and gadding about was just a waste of time. The merchants of China continued to enjoy prosperity, even though trade was confined to coastal waters. From their point of view, there was very little they needed from the outside world, so they certainly did not feel cut off.
You may well be right, that they were doing pretty well on their own. Thank you so much. We don't need it.
I mean, the country was vast. You could have anything you possibly
Huge
desired.
internal trade.
Except
And yes, but there was also a large South Asian trade.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
this European trade, what
It was
was it? But a
perceived as
blip,
marginal.
a blip on the horizon.
Yes. It may well be true that the trade with the Europeans is a blip on the horizon, but you ignore them at your own peril, because they will show up one day with gunboats, as they did everywhere, and they'll try to take your land, and they'll try to force you into humiliating peace conditions, and they'll chunk large pieces of your cities away and turn them into free trading areas, like the British did with Hong Kong. And so maybe they're a blip on the horizon, but boy, that blip grows quickly.
I think one of the really distinctive features of the competitive Western system of rationalized violence, of military technology, is the way in which very quickly it puts together new military systems. A very good example of this is the way in which the Western boats of the 1400s, 1500s begin to carry guns. And it's the gunboat which becomes the key symbol of Western imperial aggression. And that combination of really very large guns, heavier than you could handle on land, being carried on boats across the world, is a really good example of the way in which an ingenious systems building tradition starts to develop in the West.
The sort of gunpowder weapons the Westerners are bringing are things that can shoot projectiles at long range, so you can lie offshore and blast a port into smithereens. Something that wasn't happening in China, where there was nothing like the same amount of pressure to make these weapons as good as possible.
This is the culmination of 500 years in which the weapons have been changing constantly and very quickly, all the time. And
increasingly scientifically. I mean, we have this artillery officer's calipers.
This is an 18th century English device which you used to measure the exact size of a cannonball and then the size of the barrel which you were going to put the ball in. And it has mathematical tables engraved on front and back which, most importantly, tell you that for a given weight and range, this is how much gunpowder you should put in the charge. Now, what this shows you is
an accountancy of killing. Once you have heavy iron cannonballs, especially on ships, and you cast gun barrels of a certain size, the catastrophic effects of getting your sums wrong go up exponentially. I mean, it's not just discovering a rocket when the bore blows up. You will kill most of your own men. So you need to be able to do these sums. And once you need to be able to do them, instrument makers have guaranteed markets now, because they know they can sell hundreds and hundreds of very precise and beautiful devices like this to every artillery officer in the country. So more violence, more reliable violence, and more reliably monopolized violence is a very major factor in the production of precision, and vice versa.
The manufacture of cannons became a major industry in the arsenals of Europe. Here, armourers, metal workers and clockmakers pooled their talents in a unique collaboration that would lay the foundations of the steam age. Cannon moulds were made in two halves, which were bolted together and filled with molten iron to produce a solid barrel. The centre was then bored out. The idea of boring a cannon by independently manipulating the drill and the cannon was later used to finish steam engine cylinders.
There's a very close relationship, I think, between firing a shot out of a cannon and the way steam engines work. Think of a cannon as a kind of one-shot engine in which the ball takes the place of the piston and the barrel of the gun takes the place of the cylinder. If the ball is too closely fitted into the barrel, then the barrel will bend or explode. If it's not fitted closely enough, then you're not using enough of the energy developed by the force of the explosion to fire the ball out of the gun. The same is true of the way in which steam engines work. You have a piston being pushed up and down a cylinder. If the piston is engineered too close to the diameter of the cylinder, it will jam, the cylinder will bend or deform, and the engine might even explode. That ability to make a precisely engineered tube where the piston would fit snugly, but not too snugly, into the cylinder relied on the existence of a group of skilled artisans and engineers, many of them gathered round military arsenals and cannon foundries, where a lot of experiments were done both on making better guns and on the first steam engines.
Now those lathes, the big new machine tools of the 17 and early 1800s, are absolutely fundamental elements in the automation and industrialization of those years. And they start out as military systems for the Navy, for the artillery. Once these big, powerful machine tools have been designed, however, they can then be turned to a host of other uses. So, for example, the power tools which were used to make standardized parts for guns were quickly turned into machine tools that made standardized parts for railways, for steam engines, for cotton machinery. All that technology is weapons technology, and without the ability to bore cannon tubes straight, true, and reliably, you could not make the kind of steam engine that we see in 18th century England.
10 years after the triumphant opening of the Manchester to Liverpool Railway, a more aggressive display of industrial might was being unleashed in the South China Seas.
In 1839 to 40, something very surprising and unpleasant happened to a China which was still at the peak of its cultural and political self-confidence. For in the middle of trying to deal with little local difficulties, some recalcitrant British merchants selling opium at Canton, they found a large expeditionary force turning up with British naval ships beating the heck out of their forts using, well, a supreme irony, gunpowder weapons, something which had been invented in China centuries before, travelled west and was now coming back home again with a vengeance in a much more developed version.
It had become obvious in the East that a huge gap had opened up between Eastern and Western military capacity. And that gap made the East modernize. So the big question was, could you get the advantages of Western guns without the problems of westernizing the whole society? The Chinese thought yes, the Japanese thought no, and that explains the very different paths of westernization that China and Japan then take.
English civilization developed industrial technology about 80 years before anywhere else in the continent. It took Germany, France, about 70, 80 years to have their industrial revolutions. The strange thing is that almost exactly the same thing happened in Japan. It had its industrial revolution in the late 19th century, in the 1870s, 80s. It was about 70 or 80 years ahead of China. It took off just like that in 2 generations, from about 1870 to 1910. It had turned from an absolutely agrarian craft civilization into the foremost industrial civilization in the East. It was just as miraculous as the British in many ways. So why didn't India? Why didn't Islam? Why didn't China? Why only this place 70 years ahead of these other places? If you travel on the famous Japanese bullet train, the fastest train on Earth, you're struck by Japanese technology and the speed at which they can hurtle people along on metal rails using wheels. And yet if you'd gone back to the time of the rocket in England and looked around Japan for some antecedent of the bullet train, nothing, not even wheels. The basic thing that you need for a train, a wheel. They didn't have any, so it was a civilization which had forgotten the use of the wheel. This apparent mechanical amnesia was created by the widespread availability of human labor. It makes Japan's rapid transformation even more puzzling. We're passing through the largest urban concentration on this planet. Tokyo itself, the largest city with 30 million, joined up to these huge cities to the south without any break, making an urban concentration of perhaps over 50, 60 million people, all crowded into an area the size of a small English county. An immensely urbanized and compressed society. Some people think this is a recent phenomenon, but in fact Japan has always been densely populated. By the 17th century, Tokyo alone was nearly 1 million people. And you also had a huge amount of commercial activity. Artisans, craftsmen, money, banks, high literacy rates. Something like 70% of the males could read and write. And so you had the 3 constituents which many people think would lead you to an industrial revolution. And yet Japan was, in some sense, in a kind of trap.
The story of the samurai epitomizes the problem. To produce a samurai sword required months of painstaking craftsmanship. Even when the samurai stopped being warriors and became the ruling civil service elite, they continued to wear the sword as a symbol of their feudal power. Yet the samurai, unlike the scholar officials in China, did not suffer from the same degree of imperial control. One young man, called Yukichi Fukazawa, rejected the aspirations of his traditional samurai family. He had an insatiable curiosity about the West, which would drive him to play a key role in transforming Japan. He learned his first crucial lessons about the West in the 1850s, when he attended this school in Osaka, which was one of the few places where Japanese could learn about European science and technology. His teacher had learned Dutch from a small group of merchants who'd been allowed to trade with Japan.
They were trying to catch up with the whole of Western learning of some 200 years. The scientific revolution poured in to Japan through this tiny school here, nowhere else in Japan. There are only about a dozen books in this so-called university or college here for him to study from. So, for instance, there was nothing really on physics. So when they learned that there was a local daimyo who had a book on physics, there was great excitement, and they asked as a special favor to borrow this book, but they could only copy a bit of it in one night. So they chose the last 300 pages, which summarized Faraday's revolutionary theories in electricity. So one group of students were sharpening the pens, another group were making the ink, and another group were copying it out, and they managed to do it so that the leading experts on electricity in Japan were in this school.
Later, after learning English, Fukazawa was asked by the Japanese government to visit the West as part of a fact-finding delegation. He had little interest in seeing the great feats of science and engineering. He knew this information was available in books. What did interest him was the underlying fabric of European society, which he believed underpinned the economic achievements of the West. He was fascinated to witness political debate.
I learned that there were bands of men called political parties, the liberals and conservatives, who were always fighting against each other in the government. For some time, it was beyond my comprehension what they were fighting for.
Fukazawa was convinced that it was not enough to bring back technological ideas. For Japan to modernize, it needed to westernize. He even brought back that quintessentially British institution, the Businessman's Club, to Tokyo. The secretary of the club is Mr. Hattori, chairman of Seiko Watches.
When was this club founded?
It was founded in 1880 by Yukichi Fukazawa. And the purpose of this club, to get people together without the distinction of occupations or the age or
class,
class, yes.
This club
yes.
here, which was based on his memories of the Conservative Club in London, maybe?
Yes, Fukazawa always stressed the real power should be based on the harmony of people by exchange of views and exchange of knowledge among different group of people.
By bringing together industrial entrepreneurs, politicians and academics, Fukazawa helped create many new institutions. He founded Keio University, where he introduced public debate, a completely alien concept in Japan. He modeled the speaking hall on a New England church he had seen on a visit to America. His legacy of modernization secured him a place on Japan's highest denomination banknote.
Fukazawa did not want to copy everything from the West. He realized it was important that Japanese cultural and religious identity should continue to flourish. Yet he also knew that Japanese society had to undergo profound change in order to industrialize. The Japanese are amazingly adept at maintaining the core of their culture, their language, and some of their institutions. while radically readjusting their social structure. They can alter working practices and change organizations almost overnight. The integration of Western ideas into Japan's traditional culture helped me appreciate that many of the underlying features of Western society that we take for granted are essential ingredients in the making of the modern world.
In the final episode, the 10,000-year question takes us from hunter-gatherers to the Big Mac.